right, so this is the PowerPoint slides for topic 3.1, economic growth. It follows along with chapter 20 from your books. These are the same slides that I plan to show you in class, so we're going to go through them, I'll narrate them, work some examples, and hopefully that'll clarify everything for you guys. So recap from last time, stuff that is actually from your second exam that's going to carry over into this concept is the idea of GDP, gross domestic product. We know that measures a nation's output and it also is a measure of the nation's income. When we adjust nominal values into real values, the real value means that there is no inflation. We've adjusted for inflation. And then when we take that real value and adjust per capita means per person, and that helps us estimate a nation's living standards. So that is all going to carry through today. The key questions for this topic are, why does economic growth matter? And then how do resources, technology, and institutions contribute to economic growth? So our statistic for economic growth is the combination of those three concepts that you should already know: real GDP per capita, so real is adjusted for inflation, GDP is production, and per capita means per person. So this helps us estimate living standards in a nation. It gives us average income per person. And so economic growth is a measure of that statistic using a growth rate. So if you remember growth rates, that's that percentage change. So we measure economic growth as a percentage of real GDP per capita. So this last bullet point here is really important. Economic growth is the growth rate of real GDP per capita. So combining some stuff we already know, we are going to calculate the economic growth rate for 2013. So what I have here is that average income per person adjusted for inflation. And I want to calculate economic growth for 2013. So I'm going to move over to my little sketch pad here, and please be patient with me. I am still figuring out how to use this thing, so my handwriting is probably going to be bad. But what I have here is that same table that we were looking at on the slides, and we are looking for economic growth for 2013. And so our growth rate formula is that idea of the new value minus the older value, all divided by the older value, times 100. So using the idea of 2013 is the year that we want, the 2013 value of real GDP per capita is going to be our new value. So that's going to be the $52,545.25. The old value will be the previous year. So because I didn't specifically say over 2 years or anything beyond that, if I just want one specific year, the old value is going to be where the previous year. So the old value is going to be real GDP for per capita for 2012. So that's going to be $51,565.08. That there. Put some parentheses around this guy. And then we're going to divide by that old value again, the $51,565.08. Once we get all that, we'll multiply it by 100. So go ahead and grab a calculator. If you take that top portion, 52,545 minus 51,565, that top number should simplify down to 980.17. We're still going to divide that by that 51,565. 08 times 100. So type that into a calculator. And you should get 1.9%. So that's going to be our answer. That's our economic growth rate for 2013 using that new minus old over old times 100 formula. So that shouldn't be anything new. It's that growth rate formula we already know. We're just applying it to this specific statistic that we're saying measures economic growth. So these statistics definitely get very complicated. They're really big numbers. They're messy numbers. So it's important not to lose sight that we are not calculating real GDP per capita for the sake of measuring income per person. I mean, higher incomes and more economic growth is great, but it's also tied to a lot of really important statistics, even if you're not necessarily into economics. So if you're passionate about healthcare or social equality or education, you should care a little bit about a nation's economic growth rate. So what I have in this table here are averages of a lot of really important standard of living statistics for 10 of the poorest nations in the world, took the average, and 10 of the richest nations in the world. So starting with that real GDP per capita, in poor nations, average annual income is under $2,000 per year, whereas in rich countries, it's over $40,000 per year. Infant mortality, that is how many babies die within their first year. In the poor countries, it's about 53 babies out of every 1,000 live births, whereas in rich countries, that's much less likely to happen. Much more babies survive. Life expectancy is the next one. So if you have the good fortune of living in a rich country, like here in the United States, you can basically expect to live about 20 years longer than someone in one of the poorer nations. And then the next few statistics kind of explain why that infant mortality and life expectancy is the way it is. In rich countries, we have far more access to doctors, and clean water and sanitation systems and electricity are basically a given. You can see that it's over 99% in the rich countries, where that is not something you can take for granted in these poorer nations. When it comes to information and education, access to the internet and information around the world, literacy rates for men and women, much better in the rich countries. And this last statistic here, the female to male secondary education ratio, that's how many women over how many men get secondary education. You can see it's almost 1-to-1 ratio in the rich countries, whereas in the poor countries, it's a smaller number, which means less women get that higher level of education than men. So we don't just care about real GDP per capita for the sake of wealth and money. We care about it because if you care about improving people's lives, economic growth seems to be a really important indicator of that. So that brings me to this quote. It's from your book, from an economist who studies economic growth. He talks about how the consequences for human welfare in questions like these, meaning economic growth, are simply staggering. Once you start to think about them, it's hard to think about anything else. And it's that idea that wealth and economic growth is tied to so many other ideas linked to well-being and linked to ending human suffering and dealing with scarcity better in society. So that's why this is an important topic. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some historical growth. Thanks to this guy, Angus Maddison, he estimated GDP for all of the nations we could way back to the beginning of recorded human history. And it turns out for the first 1,700 years of human history, income was pretty low, and human existence was pretty miserable, pretty short, low levels of access to healthcare and all of that stuff. But I do want you to know that everything started to change around the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution was this time period of huge technological advancement. In fact, it was so fast it outpaced the population growth. So technology allowed us to have access to many more things that did not exist before. And so that began taking place in the 1800s. And since then, wealth all over the world has just kind of taken off. So here's a graph of that idea, that transformation. So we've got world GDP per capita measured in 1990 dollars. So you can see all the way back since AD 1, that graph is a flat line, very close to zero for about 1,700 years, really 1,800 years. And then you can see wealth just has taken off since then and has grown exponentially. So this graph is sometimes called the hockey stick. And it's interesting to look at because during different parts of history, you can see some historical figures here in this graph. They tend to focus on, history books tend to focus on the wealthiest people around there, but for most people, the average person, they were not among the wealthy kings, queens, Enlightenment thinkers. and folks who had access to so much wealth. So for everyday people, we are very lucky to live in this time period, this small fraction of human history where wealth is much more of a given. So at this point, I would normally play you this video called Lifespan and Wealth. I'm not going to play this over in this video because the audio quality is going to be really bad. So if you would like, you can pause this video right now, and then in that module for 3.1 Economic Growth, there is a page called Supplemental Videos. And under that first key question, I have this video linked for you. It's a short video by a guy named Hans Rosling, and he shows how economic growth has changed over time and how it's linked to health specifically. So it's a really great video. Go ahead and pause it here if you'd like to give that a watch and then come back and finish this. All right, so if you watched the Hans Rosling video, you saw that on average, the world is a much better place today than it has been over the last several centuries, but wealth has not happened equally among all the nations of the world. So just to give you an example, average income in the United States in the year 1800 was about $2,000 annually. And more recently, in 2012, Liberia's average income per person is even less than that. Whereas we in the United States have grown exponentially income per person. In some nations of the world, not picking on Liberia, just using that as an example, hasn't happened quite as rapidly. So that's what we're going to talk about, is how do we get wealthier, how do we create wealth on a global scale and improve quality of life all over the world. So one thing I'd like you to note is that the United States exponential growth from the 1800s to today did not happen quickly. It happened at a very slow rate. So that idea that small changes over time become big changes is absolutely true over a long period of time. So here I have growth rates for the United States anywhere between 0 and 2%. And that little change from almost 0% to 0.5% to a full to 2%, and 2% per year is considered pretty good economic growth. That's what really causes the explosion of wealth that we see over time. So small changes, small annual changes definitely snowball. So I have another formula for calculating economic growth. So we know economic growth is our change in real GDP per capita. So this is a new equation, and it's a little bit easier than the new minus old over old times 100. You just have to subtract out here. So this equation here at the bottom is going to be important. It should be in your concept guide. I definitely would have it handy for whenever you take the test. So this is the percent change. Remember that little triangle just represents change in real GDP per capita. So another way of saying that is economic growth equals on that side of the equal sign, that left side of the equal sign. So we start with the growth rate of nominal GDP, or percent change in nominal GDP. We subtract out population growth, which is the percent change in the population. And then we subtract out the percent change in prices. So interestingly enough, the percent change in prices, if you remember from the last topic, 2.3 on inflation, that is our definition of inflation. So another way to write this last term in the equation is subtract out inflation. So you can write this as economic growth equals, and then this long equation, and you can change that last term to inflation. So you need to know, connect the vocab words to what they mean. It makes these equations a little bit easier to memorize. So we're going to do some practice with that. So here I want to calculate the economic growth rate for 2014. So I've got all of our terms here, and we're just going to use that basic calculation. So here, see, is that same table, and we're just going to use that little subtraction problem to basically calculate economic growth. So economic growth equals, we're going to start with our nominal GDP growth, 3.9%. We're going to subtract out the population growth, I think, was next. It doesn't really matter what order you subtract out in, but we'll stick with the way I wrote the equation. And then we're going to subtract out inflation, which is our percent change in prices, minus 1.5%. And it's just as simple as typing that into your calculator. So 3.9 minus 0.7 minus 1.5, you should get 1.7% as your answer. So I think that's easier than doing the division times 100 way up here at the top. So it just depends on how the information is presented to you, which one you'll use. So hopefully that wasn't too tough. All right, I do have another example here. So this one, I urge you to read carefully. It's not quite as simple as it looks. So again, same table on this side. We're going to start with our nominal GDP. This time it's 3.5% for 2015. We're going to subtract out the population growth. Now we're subtracting out a negative number for population growth. So that means the population actually shrank this year. So we're subtracting a negative number. That's the same thing as adding a positive number. And then we're going to subtract out the percent change in prices. So here in this table, this is kind of tricky. Here I have it labeled as deflation. So hopefully you remember deflation is the same as saying negative inflation. So if I wrote this as inflation, this guy would be negative 1%. So over here, if I'm subtracting out inflation, we got to make this 1% negative because it's deflation this time. So this is going to be just like with the population change here. When I'm subtracting a negative number, it's like adding a positive. So really here I've got 3.5% plus 0.5% plus 1%. And that should all add up in your calculator to give you 5%. So don't forget, growth can be negative. Growth can, and that would represent, the economy shrinking instead of growing. That these numbers, price changes, and population growth can be negative, and that's going to be part of that formula. Sorry, went one screen too far. All right. So the last little bit of math I have for you is a little bit of a shortcut to figure out how long it would take income to double. Or how long it would take an economy to double in size. So if I had an economy that was growing 2% every single year, and we wanted to think about how long it would take that economy to double in size, doubling in size means that something grows by 100%. It grows by the full amount. Again, that's doubling. So your instincts might tell you that it would probably take 50 years if it's 2% every year. 2 times 50 is 100. But in reality, there's this thing occurs called compounding that actually makes it happen a bit faster. So compounding is this idea that at 2% growth, as something is continually growing, that 2% gets bigger and bigger. So in reality, it would only take about 35 years for an economy to double in size if it was growing 2% every year. So how I got that 35 years number is my last little equation for this topic, which is called the rule of 70. So the rule of 70 states that if a growth rate is X%, in our case from our example here, 2%, the size of my variable, the economy, any money you have in a savings account, earning an interest rate, whatever, is going to double every 70 divided by that percentage number every year. So you just take 70, you plug in whatever the growth rate is at the bottom. Be careful here, you're going to drop the percentage sign, but you are not going to put it in decimal form. So here in this case, we had a 2% growth rate, 70 over 2 is 35. So that's how you get that. You just plug in the number from the percentage. Don't convert anything to a decimal, just drop that percentage sign. It's kind of a shortcut equation. It's not really specific in this case. Your book has a more specific and complex equation to get doubling, but I'm not going to make you know that one. You just need to know the rule of 70, which is like a little bit of a shortcut. So hopefully that makes things easier. So we're going to do some practice with this rule of 70. So we typically talk about it in the context of how an economy is growing and how long it takes an economy to double in size. But this would also be true if you were to put some money in a savings account with different interest rates. So here in this table, I've got different growth rates, 0%, 1%, 2%, 3%, and 4%. We're going to see how long it takes that dollar to double and what the value is after a set 70 years. So back over to my table here, I'm going to move this way. Perfect. So to get this years to double, this is us using that rule of 70. So here, if something's growing at 0% every year, that means it's never going to double. So this is kind of a trick question. 0% growth means something's not changing. Now, if something is growing at 1% per year, we can use our rule of 70. 70 over 1, our growth rate. That means at a 1% interest rate, our dollar will double in 70 years. Okay, so when we go to a growth rate of 2%, we're just going to do 70 over 2. That's 35 years. That's the one we had from the first slide in the example. A 3% growth rate, we're going to do 70 over 3. Let's see. That should be 23.3 years, roughly, for it to double. And 4%, we're going to do 70 over 4. 70 divided by 4, that's 17 and a half years. So that one's not too bad. Just plug in that number, again, dropping the percentage sign, but not converting it into a decimal. So after a set period of 70 years at 0%, you're still just going to have that $1 at the 0% growth rate, right? Because it's not changing over that 70 years. So beginning of time, 0% change every year. After 70 years, you still got $1. This one means after 70 years, it's going to double. So if I started off with $1 and it doubles at the end of that 70 years, I'm going to have $2. Look at that. At a 2% growth rate, it's going to double every 35 years. So this is going to double twice. So it's going to turn into $2. And now that $2 is going to double again. So double $2, that's going to be $4. Surprise, surprise, it's going to double a third time for 3%. So double of $4, that becomes $8. And at 4%, it's going to double that fourth time. Double $8, that's $16. So you can see these little changes, just 1%, here to here, here to here, here to here, and in this last step is the difference between having an investment of $1 not change at all to grow to be 16 times its size. So imagine for a second, this is you trying to invest some money in the stock market, which conservatively grows about 6% or so per year. This year might be an exception with this coronavirus stuff. But over your lifetime, 6% annually. Instead of putting $1 in there, you put $1,000 in there. This is how you save money and can make a lot of money. So all the more reason to start saving, start investing earlier in your life so it's got more of those years to double, more of that 70 years or however many years you have to retirement. The sooner you start, the more compounding can take place. So this is just filling in that table there. So here I have two photos of the same skyline in Shanghai. Now, if I told you this was a skyline in an American city, you might think there were several decades, maybe even a century between these photos. This looks like something from way back when. But in reality, there is only 20 years between these photos in Shanghai. And that's because Shanghai was experiencing growth rates of about 9% annually starting in the 90s. So like I said, 2% growth is pretty good. So 9% growth is when you can see this really huge exponential change for an economy over time. So I think that's pretty incredible to look at and see the impact of economic growth. All right, so the last part here, this is for our last key question, which is how do resources, technology, and institutions create economic growth? Those are what we call the three sources of economic growth. Hopefully at this point we know how to measure it, we know why it's important. So now we're going to talk about how we make it happen and how we get more countries to be wealthy and healthy and thriving over over time. So it comes down to these three key factors, which I'll talk about a little bit each. So the first component are resources. They're also sometimes called inputs or the factors of production. We talked about these way back in the very first topic of the semester. We divide them into four main categories: land, labor, capital, and I also gave you a fourth one, entrepreneurship. We're just going to focus on the first three today because that's the one most economists tend to focus on. So, as a recap, land refers to all naturally occurring resources. So that's the stuff that comes from nature, like mineral deposits, countries that have crude oil, that certainly supports their economies because they can export that and make quite a bit of money. So land is anything that comes from nature. It's not just physical land. So this map kind of shows that. This is a heat map of GDP per square kilometer. So the darker, redder areas are the wealthier areas. So even in richer nations like the United States or some poorer continents around the world, you can see that a lot of the deeper red areas tend to be located on the coastlines, especially if you look down here at South America. You can see that's certainly true. And a lot of the wealth is concentrated on the coastlines is because coastlines are very rich in natural resources, very rich in this land. And so that facilitates lots of economic growth, lots of increased living standards in those areas. So labor is our second resource. Labor is the human effort in the production process. So it's not just a quantity variable, it is also a quality variable. So again, we've talked about human capital before, but that is how effective labor is. So think training, skills, education. We don't just want nations to have a lot of workers in order to grow. We want those workers to be skilled so that they are more productive. Something that's a bit new is the idea of brain drain. Brain drain is this phenomena that occurs when wealthy, or not wealthy, but probably wealthy, specifically skilled professionals, workers who have a lot of high education, high skill level, actually immigrate out of a country. So EM means to leave. So poor nations struggle a lot with brain drain because there's a lot of really prestigious universities in the United States and Europe. So there's more opportunity for those folks there. And so a lot of times poor nations get hurt a lot by brain drain because they lose some of their most productive and skilled citizenry to opportunities abroad. But more recently, the United States has actually been suffering from brain drain just because of the way our immigration system is set up. So whether you think there should be more or less immigration, it's kind of funky the way it's set up now. It's fairly easy to get a student visa here in the United States to come study at one of the colleges and universities here. The United States is a leader in higher education. So we get a lot of students, foreign students, who want to come study here. However, once they gain a lot of their highly skilled degrees, it's very hard to get a work visa to stay. So we get a lot of people who immigrate to the United States and then have to immigrate back out just because of the nature of the way the immigration system sets up. So brain drain can become a problem for poor nations or for rich nations because it slows down economic growth when you're losing those really most productive workers in society. We want to prevent that as much as possible. All right, capital is our third resource. When I just refer to capital in general, unless I specifically say human capital, I probably mean physical capital. It's tools and equipment that we need for goods and services. It helps my workers become more productive because they have the right tools to do the job. Another important component of capital is infrastructure. So having road systems, railway systems, even electrical grids or internet servers, access to information and connectivity, that's really going to foster economic growth because it allows you to connect with others and improve on that economic exchange. So when a society adds capital, be it physical or human capital, that's called capital deepening. It allows my workers to do their job better, whether we're talking about it in terms of having the right tools, in terms of physical capital, or having the right skills in terms of physical capital. So those are resources. That is our first component of economic growth. The second component of economic growth is technology. And it's really easy to see today how technology has allowed us to have access to so much more stuff than the people who lived way before us. So technology is a very broad term, anything that allows us to produce more or better output with the same or fewer resources. So anything that allows you to get more for less. And so we are a little bit more specific when we have technological advances. There's a combination of invention, which is an idea, knowledge, and putting it together with innovation, which means taking that knowledge, taking that idea, and putting it into practice. So technological advances are often kind of tied to that idea of entrepreneurship. We're coming up with new ways to combine resources and innovative ways to deal with scarcity. So technology has emerged all around us, even when we mean cool techie stuff or just new ways of producing things. So I have a great example here of some technological changes here in the US. So on the left here, I have a graph of the US milk cattle inventory. So dairy farmers, this is how many cows they keep around throughout the United States. So you can see since the early 1900s to the more recent years, we have less cows. But if you look at the right-hand graph, over that same exact time period, milk production has grown. So if cows are an input to the process, I'm using less cows, and I'm getting more production, more milk over time. And the reason for that is because of advancements in technology, be it, certain ways and advances in dairy farming technology and things like that. And the result has probably been better for the environment because those cows don't necessarily need as much land because we don't need as many cows in order to feed people and provide the market with milk and things like that. So that's a really good visual representation of technology, using less to produce more, essentially. All right, so that's resources, that's technology. The last and most important component of economic growth are institutions. So institutions is kind of this broad term that just refers to the rules of society, essentially. They are the conditions that shape our decision-making environments. So institutions, and a lot of times governments, have a role in setting up the institutions in society. It's basically having the incentives set up the right way so that we foster economic growth. So institutions can be both official or unofficial. Some official examples would be laws or regulations that are in place, different government bodies. Unofficial institutions are things like work habits, expectations, and political behavior. So, for example, in the United States, it's pretty typical to expect a 40-hour work week. In other nations of the world, that is not typical. Some work more, some work less, and it's not necessarily written in stone anywhere. It's just kind of this way the culture has evolved in different nations. So institutions are broadly going to affect our economic growth, whether they are official or unofficial. So these next few slides, we're going to go over some specific institutions that most people agree are really pivotal to economic growth. So the first institution that I want you to know is political stability and the rule of law, sometimes just shortened to rule of law. So the rule of law just talks about the influence of law in society. So we want a society that has a well-functioning government that establishes peace. We want just laws. We want those just laws to apply equally to everybody, and that nobody gets special favors just because they are or are related to a government official. So the better the rule of law functions in society, that's going to foster more growth. Political instability, if we are living in a nation that kind of is just having civil war after civil war, it makes it very hard to prioritize growth when there's violence around or corruption in general. So this picture on the slide here is actually from Liberia, that nation I was speaking about earlier, and that has lower average living standards than the United States did a couple hundred years ago. On the ground there, those are casings from shotgun shells because there is a lot of violence in that nation. So you have to ask yourself, on this street, would you start a business there? it's probably unlikely, and that shows why this is really the most important institution. If you don't have political stability, if you don't have the rule of law in society, it makes it really hard to prioritize economic growth and improving standards of living beyond that point. So I have this cool map here that just shows this organization called the World Justice Project. They create a rule of law index, essentially, that ranks different nations on how well the rule of law functions in society. So you can see the rank over the 126 nations that they score over time, and they base it on a bunch of different criteria. So this is a cool link. I will post it somewhere, maybe in a discussion post or somewhere in that module, so you can check it out and look at different nations and see how they score on the rule of law index. So ideally, the higher you are in the rankings, the higher your index score is, the better that rule of law functions in society. So that's kind of a cool tool. So our second institution is private property rights. Private property rights are legal rights of ownership. So that means you privately own things. It's really key for having trade happen because it allows you to exchange something that you privately own for something someone else privately owns. And if you don't have that right of individual ownership, if things are owned collectively, there's not a lot of incentives to trade. There's not a lot of incentives to maintain and take care of things. But private property rights are going to incentivize people to take care of things, to grow on their own, and to voluntarily provide. So a really good example of how private property rights can change the game is looking at the Zhejiang province of China in the 1970s. So this photo here is of something called the Zhejiang Agreement. And during the time when this agreement was written up, this is in this poor farming province of China, where things were collectively owned, including the farmland in this province. So the idea was the village collectively owned plots of land. Everybody would go out to the same plot of land every day. They would work that plot of land. Anything that grew in that plot of land was then turned into the government. The government then split it all up equally amongst the population. And the results were pretty devastating. People were starving to death because when things are collectively owned and you see someone slacking off, suddenly you don't have an incentive to do your part of the work, right? When everybody's just going to have to turn in what they produce anyways and get what they get collectively. So this Zhejiang Agreement was a secret agreement by the folks in this village, and there's even a line in here saying that what they were doing was so high risk that they might be thrown in jail, and they made arrangements for the rest of the village to raise their children if they got caught. But what they decided to do was to take that land and essentially divide it amongst themselves. So instead of everybody working the same large plot of land, what if we subdivided it? Everybody got their own little piece, and we turn in our quota to the government, but anything extra that we grew on our individual plot of land, you could keep for you and your family. So essentially what that did is it took something that was collectively owned, public property, and turned it into private property. And the results were just incredible. There was an agricultural boom in Zhejiang, and because of that idea that private property rights incentivize voluntary production, because you have the ability to keep what you produce, suddenly you're going to choose on your own to take care of it and maintain it and be as productive as you possibly can because you get to reap the benefits. So turns out Chinese officials started poking around Zhejiang after this economic explosion, which was a bit risky, like I said. In this agreement here, they made arrangements for what would happen if they were taken into custody. But this Zhejiang Agreement is actually framed in a museum. It was embraced by some economic officials in the Chinese government, and private property rights were reintroduced into that economy. And that's one of the reasons, or at least some economists say, one of the explanations for why China has become such a huge superpower in the last few decades is because of that reintroduction of private property rights. And it really just spurs an economy on. So I have a video here. This is, again, I'm not going to play it for you now, but this is in the supplemental videos page under the second key question for why do resources, technology, and institutions foster growth. This is a clip from Modern Family where Phil forgets to protect something called intellectual property. So property rights don't just apply to land, like I had in this example here, but it also applies to songs and novels and art. Here in the United States, we have this body of law called intellectual property law, which includes patents and copyrights, because we want to incentivize the creation of ideas and software and things that you can't necessarily reach out and physically touch. So that's an equally important part of private property rights as well. So check that clip out. You can pause it here if you want and then return. Maybe I'll say something else about it. All right. Third institution are competitive markets. So again, back in that first topic of the semester, we talked about how most economies are organized on a broad spectrum of market economies to a planned or command economies. This institution just means typically economies that are market-oriented tend to do a little bit better. So a market-oriented economy is an economy where the economic decisions are left up to individuals. We say people pursue their self-interest, right? Which sounds like an icky term, but really isn't. People trade for what they want, and that has a way of making everyone better off. So allowing people to trade, to start businesses, so having low regulations and low licensing hurdles to start a business, so make it easy to start a business, means there's going to be more competition in the economy. And when we have more competition among firms, that creates low prices and lots of variety for consumers. And that competitive nature of the markets kind of spurs on innovation. If you are in a market where you have to compete for customers, you're going to have to come up with creative ways, better products, newer products to keep your customers. So that creates an incentive to invest. And it leads to that process of creative destruction. We talked about creative destruction back in the unemployment chapter when we watched that video about the caveman who lost his job in the Stone Age as we progressed into the Bronze Age. So that idea is true here as well. When firms are facing stiff competition for business, they're going to have to come up with those innovative products, cheaper ways to produce things that creates that variety and those low prices for consumers and creates new products over time as well. Right? Someone had to come up with a smartphone to stay competitive in that cell phone industry. So that process, that competition among businesses, that really spurs on economic growth and economic development. So that's a key institution. So within this competitive market institution, there's kind of two sub-institutions. So competitive markets and having an economy that has competitive markets doesn't just apply to making it easy to exchange and start a business within a nation's borders. We also mean internationally. So having free and open trade is going to give people access to more things all around the world and expose businesses to more competition from all over the world. And so we get more of that healthy competition, more of that creative destruction globally. So having free international trade means minimizing those protectionist barriers, minimizing tariffs, minimizing quotas. When nations lock themselves off from free trade, they tend to be less wealthy than the nations that are open to it. So having free trade is also a part of that institution. And then it also leads to the flow of funds across borders. So we talked about in the resources component that capital, investment in tools, or even investment in human capital is really important to make my workers more effective. In order to have capital investment, you have to save money. And in the United States, we have really dismal levels of savings. In fact, economists are pretty worried about this. So it makes it hard to create capital, make workers more productive, and then grow in the future if we don't have savings. So the good news, though, is in the United States, we allow a lot of foreign investment. Lots of foreign folks want to buy stock in American business, And so we can access global savings over time, and that kind of helps fill the gap, given that most Americans don't save themselves. So with access to more savings means access to more future growth. A really good example of why savings are important for future growth is thinking about your own college education. If you are currently attending Valencia or any other type of school using financial aid, someone had to save those dollars in order for you to get those student loans. So saving is going to be that key component to investing in human capital like higher education or physical capital like machinery in order to get that future production, in order to make my workers more skilled and more productive over time. So the more access we have to savings, funds or savings flowing across borders is going to be key to growth in the future. Efficient taxes is another institution. So what makes a tax rate efficient? Depending on who you ask, varies widely. But most people acknowledge that taxes create this trade-off. If I tax something, I get less of it. Taxes are like a penalty for economic production. However, we also know that taxes go to pay for different governments, and our first institution was political stability and the rule of law. So what efficient taxes mean is delicately balancing that trade-off between not taxing economic activity too much so that I don't get economic activity, but also taxing enough so that I have that tax revenue to make sure we have political stability and effective government. So depending on what we tax, there's going to be that trade-off. So in the United States, we use income taxes quite a bit. So an income tax is basically a penalty on real GDP per capita, right? Because GDP is income. So we don't want income taxes to be too high, or it disincentivizes people generating that income. And if we think about, taxing other countries and other countries' output using tariffs, then we're limiting international trade, which was another institution that we said was important to growth just on the last slide. So we know taxes are going to disincentivize some form of economic activity. We just don't want to have them be too high, that becomes too much of a burden on economic growth, but also not too low that we can't have that first key institution of effective government. So hopefully that makes sense. And our last key institution is stable money and prices. So a lot of nations around the world suffer from hyperinflation. Their money and their currency doesn't function well. People don't trust it. It's unpredictable. So when that creates uncertainty in the economy, it really slows down economic growth. It makes it really hard to get a loan to start a business when you don't know what the value of the dollar is going to be in the future. In countries like Zimbabwe, Venezuela, those countries that suffer from really dramatic hyperinflation, pretty much grinds the economy to a halt. So in the United States, we have this institution called the Federal Reserve, or sometimes called the Fed for short, and they are the institution that represents our monetary authority in the U.S., which is just a way of saying they keep inflation under control. And the Federal Reserve is politically independent, meaning that there's no political party affiliation, no Republican and Democrat Fed leaders for the most part, though then again these days everything's a little bit political. But it's supposed to be an apolitical body because we don't want political monetary policy. We talked about at the end of the inflation chapter that a lot of times governments overinflate their money supply to pay off debt. So here in the United States, when we have this authority controlling inflation, we don't want them to be expressly political, or they'll just print money to spend on whatever they want and create hyperinflation throughout the economy. So in the US, the Federal Reserve represents this institution of monetary policy that's super stable, that's not subject to that political whim of printing just to spend. And that's why we have inflation that's pretty much under control here. So stable money and prices is our last institution. So all of those are pretty important for having a successful economy. This last video, again, the last video on the supplemental videos pages. This is a clip from a movie that represents some of the ideas in the United States and some of the official and unofficial institutions there. So check that out, and that's about all I have for you on economic growth. So if you have any questions moving forward, definitely make sure at this point to take the practice quiz. Also check out the practice application questions so you can get some practice in with these concepts and with those formulas from the beginning. And read the concept guide. All of these ideas should be echoed in the concept guide. And email me if you have any questions. Stay healthy. Bye.